Hello, and welcome to Talking General Practice, the podcast from GP Online. I'm Emma Bauer, the editor of GP Online. Today on the podcast, I'm speaking to Dr. Duncan Shrewsbuy, who's a GP and the co-chair of the Society of Academic Primary Care, about the important role academia has to play in general practice, both in terms of teaching and research. In this conversation, Duncan talks about the importance of research in primary care. They explain how practices can become more involved in research or start their own smaller scale research projects within their own practice or PCN, and discuss sharing data from the GP patient record for large scale research projects. Duncan also explains how changes to the way undergraduates are taught is starting to shift the perception of general practice among medical students and other branches of medicine, and offers advice to other GPs on how to develop a career in research and teaching. I'm really pleased to welcome onto the podcast now Dr. Duncan Shrewsbury, who's an academic GP in Brighton and co-chair of the Society of Academic Primary Care, which champions expertise in academic primary care with the aim of improving provision. Duncan is a reader in clinical education and primary care at Brighton and Sussex Medical School, where they lead the development of GP teaching across the undergraduate programme and support research within the school. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast, Duncan.
Thank you very much for having me.
First of all, can you explain a bit about what your current role in academia involves and how you combine that with a role in general practice?
Sure. I work 3 days a week for the medical school, in which I support the team responsible for leading curriculum development. So curricula ought not to be static. They should be constantly changing and evolving and responding to the context in which we work. And so our learners get the most sort of contemporaneous and relevant education to prepare them to be the next generation of doctors. So we're constantly engaged in an ongoing project of developing and redeveloping. It's important as part of curriculum development to bring faculty on that journey with you through faculty development and support them in their ability to deliver the programme. So a lot of what I do is also around faculty development and faculty support as well. On top of that, I do get the opportunity to deliver direct teaching to our medical students. I also engage in a little bit of research through supervising research students, undergraduate, masters and doctoral students. And as part of my research obligation, I also support the department in their research strategy, nurturing other researchers, especially earlier career researchers in their endeavours, supporting the evaluation of research outputs for the Research Excellence Framework that all universities in the UK have to participate in. Wednesdays, I'm in general practice. Tuesdays, I work as a clinician in the Regional Gender Service. So I'm still clinically active 2 days a week, although only one of those days is in general practice at the moment.
You're involved in research and teaching. Is that normal if you move into like a career as an academic GP? Do you normally you do a bit of both, or is it more you tend to focus on one side or the other?
That's a really good question, because it's really difficult being pulled in lots of different directions. You've got your clinical responsibilities and then your academic responsibilities. And generally speaking, when you do tend to do research, you tend to develop such a focus on what you're doing that can be quite all-consuming, especially if you're to be, I guess, competitive and more likely to be successful at applications for large program grants, big pots of money, funding for big research projects. You do tend to find that most people who are engaged in research do support the delivery of teaching, usually teaching in the area that they specialise in their research. But you tend to find that the teaching responsibility is usually limited to the direct delivery of teaching aligned to that area of interest, rather than perhaps taking on broader program responsibilities that I have in my role. So it's a bit unusual to try and balance a focus on teaching, curriculum and research. And I would say, my focus on research is very modest, and my research portfolio is not the focus of my academic role. So I am very specifically on an education and scholarship contract, which means contractually I'm the focus of my work is to be around the curriculum development and curriculum delivery.
You're the co-chair of the Society of Academic Primary Care. If people don't know, what does the SAPC actually do?
So the Society of Academic Primary Care does a number of things, but I guess at the heart of what we do is promoting high quality research in the primary care space, so that both teaching and practice of general practice of primary care can be as evidence-based, as contemporaneous, and as high quality as possible for our communities, the communities that we serve. We work towards achieving that through a number of different ways. One, we have the strand of scholarship that permeates through our activities, that helps share research that is done, helps promote high quality research, and recognises high quality research. That's partly achieved through, for example, our regional and international conferences, where we support networking and showcasing of incredible work. And that's also where we award prizes to high quality work in recognition of work of excellence in the space. And then we also have two fantastic networks within our organisation called the Heads of Teachers and the Heads of Departments group. And those two groups represent all departments of primary care in the UK, which tend to be, but not exclusively, aligned to medical schools within the UK. And those networks are essential for supporting the practitioners on the ground, if you will, specifically relating to things like general practice teaching within the undergraduate program, or graduate entry programs, if relevant. And then the heads of department group are the sort of equivalent for with a research focus, but also look quite strategically at how departments are supported, how departments are positioned, the development of departmental strategies. Often academia is seen as a little bit of an ivory tower and a bit out of touch. Yes, it's true by virtue of anybody engaging in a portfolio of work that isn't exclusively patient care delivery in general practice, there will be a slight differing of perspectives. But that's not to say that academia isn't grounded in real life challenges that face general practice. And I would want to see a sort of dissolution of that false image that academia is an ivory tower, because it is scholarship and scholarly activity is for everyone. What we do day in, day out by synthesizing information and guidelines and what our patients are telling us and what we're seeing in the news, and we're constantly working with huge amounts of information, applying our professional judgment and coming out with a recommendation. That in itself is a scholarly process. So we have the skills, and we have the interests, and so scholarship really is absolutely for everybody. And I would really hope to see a much greater sense of access to scholarly activity and to getting involved in both teaching, but also in research, in asking questions and generating the answers to those questions, and how that might impact on, say, earlier career researchers coming into the space, how we might best support our colleagues across the board.
Why is research in primary care so important, and are we doing enough to make the most of it, do you think?
Well, research in the primary care space is of vital importance, partly because over 90% of the work of healthcare, and you'll probably find that percentage is equivalent in other health systems too, but certainly in the NHS, is undertaken in primary care. In order for the evidence base that we draw on to be relevant, we need research to be conducted within that space to answer specific questions that relate to the nature of care that we deliver. So I think the case for why research in primary care is important is quite tight. As to whether that plays out into parity of research, I think there's probably a fair way to go yet. And that's tied to all sorts of complex issues, such as the nature of streams that fund work in different domains, and also the nature of sort of political foci within the space. Certainly, you tend to find that there are particular disease areas that attract greater amounts of funding, either from industry or through non-industry partners, such as the National Institutes of Health Research, which I think are doing a lot to try and shift away from specialist-orientated research or specialist-aligned research to more condition or priority theme aligned research, so that hopefully people from diverse backgrounds are able to apply to undertake work in that space, including those from primary care and general practice. As to whether those sorts of initiatives are effective, I think is yet to be seen, and probably there's a feeling that they're not quite achieving parity yet. The sorts of questions that we generate in primary care tend to be of a complex nature that require a longer term view in order to answer them. And it's really difficult to attract funding for something that's complex and something that's going to take a long time. Funders, generally speaking, want to be able to answer a nice, neat, relatively simple question in a short space of time in order to show impact and output from investment. And that's something that is just much harder to do with the complex nature of the sort of questions that we generate in primary care.
What needs to happen to shift that, though? If we need to get more funding into primary care research, how do you think things need to change?
Well, I'm ever mindful of the aphorism that there is no magic money tree, and of course things would be made much better if there was generally just a bit more to go around everywhere, as is the same for the NHS, of course. But short of that happening, which of course is unlikely, I think there probably needs to be a redevelopment of the metrics by which research output are evaluated, so that we're less focused on immediate short-term goals and perhaps more focused on longer-term goals and longer-term impact, to enable a sort of bigger picture view to be taken of certain areas.
One of the other things I wanted to ask you about is about the sort of benefits of practices being involved in research. There was some data the other week from the National Institute for Health and Care Research that showed that during 2023-24, more than half of all GP practices took part in research that they support. So that's a big increase. That was a 12 percentage point increase over the previous year. What are the benefits of practices being involved in research, and why do you think more practices are getting involved in research?
Yes, that data is really heartening, because it shows the hard work from organisations like the Royal College of GPs paying off in terms of trying to support practices engage in research and scholarship. We know from secondary care data that organisations that are involved in teaching and research tend to have better patient outcomes. So we can extrapolate from that it's likely, although we don't have the data to show that it is absolutely true, but it's likely that practices that are involved in research and or teaching are somehow enabled to deliver care that is perhaps more contemporaneous, of a higher quality, and perhaps more responsive to the circumstances of the time, and in doing so achieve better outcomes for their patients by one means or another.
How can practice, if they want to get more involved in research now, what advice would you give them about how to get involved?
First and foremost, the Royal College of GPs have put quite a lot of work into developing their Research Ready scheme, which is a scheme to support practices to get involved in research through clinical research networks and things like that, with support or linking to support from the National Institutes of Health Research. There can occasionally be a small amount of funding that follows these sorts of things to support that engagement. But then there's also the opportunity to start thinking about how a practice may itself start stepping into the research space, and maybe even conducting research as a team on their own, or networked within their primary care network or other partners. We would always be keen to support that, both as an organisation, so through approaching SATSI for information and guidance around that, but also to support that through showcasing the work that they do in the events that we run, and the publications that we share. And it would be tremendously exciting to see a greater representation of frontline-led research coming through and starting to address some of the questions that people on shop floor are facing day in, day out.
If somebody wanted to do something like that, what sort of things would they be looking at it? Would they be doing research based around challenges in their particular areas? That what the focus of that kind of research would be on?
I think that's one of the beauties of research, is that there is space and potential to explore a really broad range of issues that you may find of interest. And I would guess my first tip would be, if there's a particular clinical question or a service delivery problem that you come up against, you get a bee in your bonnet about it, that is usually a good source of passion that is necessary to drive good research. If there's a particular area that you're really interested in, start by reading into that and seeing what is already known about the space. If you find from your reading that actually not a huge amount is known, people aren't writing about it, or there isn't much by way of data or evidence out there, then that's probably quite fertile ground to explore how you might start filling that gap. And you can start with relatively simple measures, such as a systematic literature review. You formalize that search that you've done to look for information in that space, summarize the information that you're able to find, and you synthesize it, analyzing it and creating a new understanding from bringing all those different bits of information together and representing that to the community through a publication in the form of, say, a systematic literature review. And that's a good starting point. And then from there, you have a really good start developing your research questions, which refine your thinking from the bigger picture view that you have into, right, well, how do I contain that within something that I can answer? The development of your research questions will be very much influenced by the resources you have available, the sorts of approaches that you're able to take to address them, such as how wide your network is, what support you're able to draw on, how physically how many people are there to deliver on this work. And then it would be really, really sensible to make sure that you're linked in with the Department of Academic Primary Care so that you can draw on any support that they have to offer.
General practice is so busy at the minute. Everybody really struggling with the amount of work that they've got to do. Have you found that because of that, there's less of these research projects going on, or do you think it's still something that obviously there must be very rewarding personally to get involved in some of these things? So is it something that GPs are still being involved in a lot, even though they've got so much else they have to do as well?
I think that's one of the great things about general practice is that general practice is made up of teams that have incredible resources in terms of the fortitude they have and the resilience they have, and also the ability to adapt and to pursue areas of importance to their patients. Despite the pressures on general practice, we do still see people engaging in areas that they think are important to their communities. And because of that, we see the rewards in terms of the research outputs being much richer for their involvement. Although there are enormous pressures across the whole system, especially in general practice, we are still seeing good levels of involvement. I think there's always room to improve, and I would hope that if there were a desire to see a greater involvement in general practice, that would come with a commitment to supporting it appropriately with the necessary funding and with the necessary resourcing, both within primary care departments through making sure that people and structures are in place to support people engaging in research, through the availability of hard cash in order to appoint people to posts to facilitate the work that needs to be done.
Because we have the NHS and because of the GP patient record in particular, the UK is obviously quite a good place to do research, isn't it?
Yes, so the UK is quite unique in that general practice adopted computerized medical records relatively early. And so because of that, we have a well-linked database of general practice records from across the country. And one example of this is the CPRD. That is a resource that researchers can buy access to coded clinical information. And we find that researchers from across the whole world value that and will buy into that. I myself collaborated with some colleagues from the United States who were interested in looking at the mortality rates from cancer within transgender patients. The best way that they could look into that was through using data from computerized records. It's highly valued and highly prized and accessed from around the world in order to answer research questions that are of a particular nature. You do tend to find that those sorts of big data projects do still need to be supported by qualitative research that is more suited to exploring and understanding why things happen the way they do.
Data is becoming increasingly important as well from a planning point of view, as well as clinical research. But obviously, GPs are legally responsible for the GP patient record. And there has been some concerns in some quarters about the use of big data and external companies having access to all of this data in patient records. In your view, is that something we should be worried about, do you think?
It's definitely something we should be mindful of. It's an important responsibility
Right.
that we have in terms of gatekeeping access to our patients' sensitive information. And it's crucial to maintaining our patients' trust in terms of maintaining their confidentiality and making sure that their information is only ever used in a way that they consent to. I'm not sure that means we need to be overly worried per se, because there are, I think, quite good examples of where it's been the case for quite some time, several years now. Companies, research organizations are able to access these sorts of databases, and they do so within a very structured framework that governs their access and governs the use of data to answer very, very specific questions. So there is quite strict governance around that. And I think as long as that is maintained and as long as that continues to evolve with the times and evolve with the different types of data that there are and the different ways that data can be used, I think there is likely to continue to be safety within that.
Undergraduate teaching is really important when it comes to achieving parity of esteem for general practice. And there's been a lot of work in recent years to make sure that general practice is a more important part of undergraduate training for doctors and that medical students spend more time in general practice than they have in the past. Is that actually happening now?
I think there's reasonable evidence from both ear on the ground that we get that intelligence through, for example, the Heads of Teachers group, but also there have been some systematic inquiries resulting in publications in this space that have demonstrated that both the fact that we know that when learners are exposed to high quality and greater sort of frequency of placements, they are much more likely to choose a career in that space. But that medical schools are responding to recommendations around increasing the amount of general practice teaching within their programs. And that's both through greater provision of placements throughout the program, but it's also through greater representation of general practice in the teaching that is delivered. So you can have a general practitioner very much teaching about, for example, heart attacks. For example, we see people with conditions relating to and sometimes presenting with heart attacks in general practice. And so we're just as well placed to deliver teaching on that as, say, our secondary care colleagues, who might come in a little bit later with some more specific and specialised knowledge around secondary care specific management, but looking at how we improve the representation of general practice within other aspects of teaching within these programs is also key to achieving parity of esteem as well. And we are starting to see that.
Is this kind of change in education, do you think it started to have an impact on the perception of general practice? I mean, you suggested that it was about students, but also obviously longer term amongst other branches of medicine as well.
I think the impact that we're seeing is starting to gain traction and that we're starting to see colleagues appreciate general practice differently. So recognizing that GPs have expertise that may very well align to or overlap with their specialist field. And we're also seeing a change, I think, in the way that different specialties and different colleagues within medical schools relate to general practice. So I think there is a greater understanding and perception of quite what we do and how, one, academic and scholarly that is, but two, how challenging both intellectually and from a sort of broader clinical sense the work that we engage with really is. And I've certainly seen that play out as a much greater appreciation for one, how busy we are in general practice, but two, for quite what it is we're holding and handling in the primary care space, which is quite complex pathology. That's certainly something that is starting to come through in terms of sort of attitudes from colleagues that will be playing out in how students see us as well, because students do pick up on what we say and what our colleagues say about one another. And so hopefully that greater appreciation and respect will be percolating through, having that impact on students as well.
That seems really positive, because I very much remember when there was a big push on all of this quite a few years ago. Really encouraging to see that maybe things are starting to shift a bit. You've made your portfolio career with a big focus on education and teaching. If there are any younger GPs or newer GPs listening to this, what would you say to encourage them to make research or teaching part of their career going forward? And what's the best way to do that?
That's a good question. I would say, from a purist's point of view, if you wanted to get a good grounding in how to understand and conduct high quality research, pursuing specific training to do so through a master's and a PhD would be a good place to start. One of the benefits of pursuing that route is it then positions you well to apply for formal academic posts within institutions, which now often do require higher degrees. Having said that, that's not the only route in, and that's not the only way to do it. It is perfectly possible to avoid having to undertake further higher study. You can get involved in research without, of course, any of that. Getting involved in teaching is a bit different from getting involved in research. And most medical schools will engage with their local GP community to seek their support for delivery of communication skills teaching, of teaching of clinical skills, and of teaching of things like clinical decision making and stuff like that. And most medical schools will be quite good at putting on information events and putting out flyers and adverts for opportunities as they crop up, to support people in getting involved with those. And they may start off as sessional based. And it's a good way to get your foot in the door and to get started. And from there, you can look at opportunities to grow that experience through diversifying the teaching that you deliver. The other way to gain further experience is to look at how the local medical schools engage with the GP community to help support their program of assessments as well. So assessments is an important part of education, just as much as teaching is. And you'll find that a lot of medical schools will require GP expertise to help deliver their program of OSCEs, Objective Structured Clinical Examinations. And all of these things will look good on your CV and will support the cultivation of an educational portfolio. Looking at how you grow your experience in the postgraduate arena will be really helpful too. So if you're working in a practice that has GP trainees, looking at how you may support their training through perhaps providing opportunity for debrief or getting involved in delivery of some tutorials, all of that will start feeding your experience in teaching, but also in responding to educational need, which will all stand you in really good stead.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast, Duncan.
Thank you very much for having me, Emma. It's been wonderful meeting you.
Well, that's it for this week. Thanks so much to Duncan for taking the time to talk with me, and thank you for listening. We're having a week off next week because of various holidays, so I'll be back for our regular news review at the start of September, so please do join me then. In the meantime, don't forget you can keep up to date with all the latest news affecting general practice and access lots of other resources and information on our website at GPonline.com.